I was pre-diabetic, reversed it in 2 months. 2 months, people. By addressing this. Not this, this. But what happens at this point, you're pre-diabetic, and what do? They give you a medication. They'll start you on something like metformin, right? Which works in terms of bringing the glucose down, but it doesn't help with this. Right? So when that stops working, when that silver shiny thing stops working, they'll add another and another and another until eventually this chronic symptom, like many of the others, may end up taking your life. Now, every one of them. Insulin resistance, I mean, let's look at just this one here, right? Forget the rest. Let's look at heart disease. Most of us on this live, we likely know somebody who's struggling with this or possibly even lost their lives to it. And this is not surprising because this one thing alone takes in excess of 20 million lives a year. 20 million, and that is increasing year on year on year on year. This thing in 3 years is taking out enough people that would almost entirely wipe out the entire population of the UK. That is the equivalent of how many lives this thing takes. And every one of these are on the increase, and that is rooted in insulin resistance. Now, we're going to look at how this leads to this, right? But that is just one of these chronic conditions. One. Furthermore, metabolic scientists are saying this begins in an individual up to 20 years before it develops into one or more of these chronic symptoms. So let's have a look at this, because let's look at insulin resistance relative to let's just look at blood pressure, shall we? Anybody on this live struggling with blood pressure issues? So if you're struggling with low blood pressure, do me a favour, put letter LB in the comments for low blood. If you're struggling with high blood pressure, put HB in the comments for high blood pressure. And then we'll look at how insulin resistance leads to this, because in order to understand any of these things, we first need to understand what happens in our body when we choose to consume food. And this is very, very, very important, because when you and I eat, the body does not respond to calories. And I mean not one bit. There's no receptor, there's no response to calories, because the body does not have any receptors to calories. So when we eat food, what is the response? It's a hormonal response. And in this modern food environment where 70% of all consumption in the Western world is ultra-processed, sugary carbs, etc., sugar and carbs, then what happens is the body takes the food and it pushes the glucose from that food into our bloodstream. Now, when the glucose hits the bloodstream, this is when the body responds. The response is the pancreas begins to secrete this hormone called insulin. So let's think about this for a minute. What's the purpose of insulin? Insulin is secreted into our bloodstream in response to this glucose from food. Insulin will then travel throughout our entire body, and it will interact with every cell making up every organ on our body, because every cell has attached to it an insulin receptor, not a calorie receptor. So the mechanism for this goes a little like this. Let me explain this more visually. Imagine for a moment my head is the hormone insulin. It's traveling through my bloodstream in response to glucose. Further, imagine this right here is just one single receptor of one single cell. So along comes this hormone called insulin in response to glucose, and it interacts with every single receptor of every single cell. This works almost like a lock and key mechanism, and at this point what happens is the cell opens up. Now, once the cell is open, insulin will take the glucose from your bloodstream and mine, almost like an Uber Eats delivery person, and it will deliver that glucose into every single cell as energy and nutrients. And in simple and basic terms, this is how every cell in our body gets its energy and nutrients. Furthermore, when we've overconsumed energy, which happens a lot in this food environment, right? We overconsume energy. So think about what's happening in our bodies here at this point. We have excess glucose in our bloodstream as a result of overconsumption, but this is to the extent that the hormone insulin can get no more of that energy into these cells. Now, you may be wondering why, and it's really simple. They're full. The body has got all the energy and nutrients it needs right now. So then what happens to this excess glucose energy, because there's no room in the cells for any more? Do you know what happens to it? Would you believe? Insulin is a dominant hormone, by the way. It's a hormone. And that's for good reason. Because it is the only hormone in our body that takes this excess energy and begins to store it on our bodies, predominantly in the form of fat. Subcutaneous, then eventually as visceral fat. So what happens is, we'll have our breakfast. So let's think about this. In actual fact, let me share have we got any visual learners on here? let me just ask you a question. If you're more like me in terms of your approach to learning, whereby I learn well with this, but when it's put together with a visual, that enhancement or my ability to learn is enhanced greatly. If that's you, just put letter V in the comments. Because let me take you back about 30 months in my life, and I'll share with you exactly what one day in my life looked like back then that had, unknowingly for me, at this time in my life, it had led to insulin resistance. But let me also be clear, look, my body metabolizes food exactly the same way yours does. So what I'm going to be sharing with you here is the way in which everybody develops insulin resistance. So let me see if we've got any visual learners. I've not forgot about blood pressure. We'll come to that in a minute, by the way. We've got M, Lorraine, User, Judy. Okay, let's have a look in. We've got a few more coming in. We've got Paul, Honey. Right, let's have a look at this, because this is what happened for me, right? Let me explain this diagram. This represents my bloodstream. This was my food intake. I would wake in the morning and have my breakfast. The body takes that food, pushes it, converts it into glucose and pushes that glucose into my bloodstream. Now this is represented by this blue line right here. And as a reminder, the second this glucose hits the bloodstream, the body's responding. That response is the pancreas begins to secrete this hormone called insulin. That's represented by the purple line. Now there are two main fuel sources for your body, one of which is glucose, and the other of which is fat. Insulin comes in and it will never undershoot glucose. It's always either equal to, more frequently it's just above. But what's happening in a metabolically healthy person is this hormone insulin will take this glucose, deliver it as energy and nutrients to the cells, and if there's any surplus, it will also take that and store it in our bodies for later use, predominantly in the form of fat. But typically in a healthy person, this hormone called insulin is going to bring this glucose down within a couple of hours. However, this is a hormone, people, and this can remain in your bloodstream for up comfortably 4 to 5 hours. And that's if you're healthy. Now, if you're metabolically unhealthy, it can be comfortably double that. And insulin, are you aware of this, by the way? Listen to this. This blew my mind. Insulin inhibits access to energy from fat cells. In other words, in the presence of the hormone insulin, your body cannot efficiently burn body fat for fuel. So no glucose from food there. We've got elevated insulin. Where's your body going to get its energy? At this point, a couple of hours in, I was starting to feel low energy, low mood, and this right here, unknown to me at the time, it is enhancing another hormone in my body that is called ghrelin. It's more commonly known as the hunger hormone. So look what was happening for me mid-morning. Now, I wasn't starving, I'd just eaten, right? But mid-morning, I was having a snack. Did anybody on this live know that this right here, hunger, is hormonally driven? If you knew that, and just put the letter H in the comments. I had no idea. It is, by the way, and this is what causes it. This is enhancing it. So every morning, mid-morning, I was hormonally driven for this snack. And let me add, this is not a big snack. This could just be a biscuit, packet of crisps, maybe even just a piece of fruit. In actual fact, this right here could just be a drink with milk and sugar in. But here's the issue. You see this? Even this causes your glucose to spike again. So look what's happening, people. Every morning of my life, just as this hormone insulin was beginning to make its way back down, more glucose was hitting the bloodstream, and the body's response is the only response that it has. The pancreas secretes more insulin to deal with this additional elevation of glucose. And this pattern, repeated with my lunch, just a light lunch by the way, not a big one, my afternoon snack I never missed, and my evening meal. Now let me ask you a question. We've got 120 people on this live. If you're currently living this lifestyle, do me a favour, and you're in the position to, let me know in the comments, put the letter L in the comments, because this was me. And regularly, if I'm honest, I used to take this and have it again right here. About 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening in the form of supper before bed, right? In the form of, sometimes I'd even have that in bed, a bowl of cereal in bed. So look what's happening, people. This modern food environment where they are actually promoting this lifestyle, that's what they're doing, leads to what? It leads to elevating our blood sugars every 2 to 3 hours. Now that leads to this, where we're living in a state of constantly elevated insulin, where we never leave enough time between these meals and snacks for this hormone insulin to come back down. Now you may be wondering, why is this an issue? Let me explain. The longer you live this lifestyle, This constantly elevated insulin will, not may or could, but it will eventually become chronically elevated. Now, when that happens, it gets stuck. And so what happens here is what? Well, think about this. Let me go back. So 30 months in my life, guess what? This was me 30 months ago. Every cell in my body, unknowingly to me at this time, was so constantly chronically bathing in this hormone insulin for probably 20, 25 years at this point, to the extent where every cell in my body was becoming deaf to it. It was becoming resistant to the hormone insulin. I mean, think about this. So what's happening now over a period of time is insulin's coming along, knocking on the door of these cells, and whereas before it was doing this, over a period of time, it'll do this, and this, and this, and this. And then eventually you'll start to feel what? Lethargic, low mood, low energy, fatigue, even chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia. But over an extended period of time, you would find that ultimately late stage insulin resistance, your blood sugars will no longer be coming down. They will actually be going up and up and up, because this eventually leads to pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So let's have a look at this then now. So let's come back to this and let's look at high blood pressure or low blood pressure. How on earth does insulin resistance lead to this? So let's consider this. Let me scroll back up and see if I can find who's got these low blood pressure, high blood pressure. Halima, it's really sad but eye-opening. It is indeed. So we've got Summerled, so he's got low blood pressure. We've got high blood pressure, high blood pressure, high blood pressure, low blood pressure. Neen's got low blood pressure. Robert Barber's got low blood pressure. Ali's low blood pressure. Just stumble on this. What's your background, please? In terms of my own background, look, I'm not medically trained, if that's what you're asking. Let's have a look. So, let's have a look. So we've got a couple of people struggling with blood pressure, whether that be low blood pressure or high blood pressure. So let's look at how insulin resistance leads to this thing. Because, and let me just be clear, every one of these conditions, insulin resistance is driven by what? Too much sugar in your blood. If you've got erectile dysfunction, you have too much sugar in your blood. If you've got PCOS, you have too much sugar in your blood. If you've got low blood pressure, high blood pressure, etc. But let's have a look at how this leads to this. Let's start with the blood, right? And let's look at how, because at any one time, by the way, are you aware you only need 1 teaspoon of sugar in your blood? 1 teaspoon. Do you know how much we consume in the modern Western world? Because every carbohydrate turns to sugar in your blood, especially if it's ultra processed and it's sugary, right? So here's the thing. Most people in the Western world, they are consuming in excess of 60 teaspoons of sugar every day. Little wonder this is becoming a problem then, right? So let's have a look at how this thing leads to blood pressure. So I'm going to put you down here. I'm going to try to explain it. Can I put you down? I can put you down. Okay, so let's look at this, because, look, I am 50 years old now, and I'm of an age where every year I could phone the clinician, the doctor, and I could say, Doctor, I want an annual check, almost like an annual MOT for humans, right? So, but let me add, they'll never ring you, never, ever, ever. Why? Well, because they're overrun, right? These hospitals, they're not getting smaller, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger, more doctors, and consultation times reducing. So this is the problem. And so if I was to ring them and book this test, they would take me in, they'd do things like my weight, my height, they'd run a blood test, they'd do my blood pressure, and within that blood test they'd be testing for things like what? High cholesterol. So they'd be testing for cholesterol, HDL, LDL, they'd test your triglycerides, your liver function. They'll test things like your kidney function. They'll also test your something called your HbA1c. Now, your HbA1c, this is the key indicator for insulin resistance. Now, let's have a look at this. What do I mean by that? What is HbA1c? Because if you're a type 2 or a pre-diabetic, you may well have heard of this thing called HbA1c or A1c if you're in the US or Canada, but not fully understand what it is. So what are they measuring? Well, firstly, these are your hemoglobin blood cells. So your red blood cells that live in your system for about 90 days and then they renew, they regenerate. This is why they do blood tests every 90 days. But the HbA1c is measuring what? In essence, it is measuring something called the glycation of your blood, which means what? It's the amount of sugar attached to your red blood cells, which is causing your blood to do what? To thicken and become sticky. Your blood literally becomes thick. It becomes sticky because there's too much sugar in it. Sugar is like the thickening agent. So what's happening here? What leads to low blood pressure then? Well, let's consider this and let's do a little bit of a... what am I thinking of? Let's do a little bit of an analogy, right? Imagine for one moment, you and I, we have dug out a wonderful water feature in our back gardens. Now we start to put some rocks in, we put a pump in, and then we fill it with water. That water is clean, it's pure, it's perfect. Then we turn this pump on and the fountain starts to spray, and this is beautiful. This fountain is spraying up, it's doing maybe about 5 feet in the air, and it looks majestic, it's pristine, it's just how it's meant to function. Now, you start to put some thickening agent in that water, what happens? Think about this logically, what happens? You start to put thickening agent, well, the first thing that's going to happen is you are putting unnecessary pressure or burden on the pump. That's the first thing that's happening. Now the pump's still going to function, but you're placing burden on it that ordinarily it should not have to deal with, right? So you're placing an extra burden on your pump, but it will still pump up and it would still spray this fountain, but you start to thicken that fluid, it's not going to spray it 5 feet in the air. It might spray it 4 feet 11, 4 feet 10, 4.5 feet, 4 feet, 3.5 feet. You see what's happening? The thicker that fluid is, the greater the burden on the pump and the less pressure is coming out of the pump. What do you think's happening in the body? When you and I have got excess glucose, we elevate our HbA1c just 1%. 1%. That is placing additional burden on our heart. The blood is thicker than ordinarily it should be, in terms of for our body to function at optimum level, and as it's thicker, the heart is pumping, but it's pumping this fluid through and it slows down because it's a thicker fluid. This is what causes low blood pressure. And you think about this, what you go into the medical world and they sit down and they say, let's have a look, who we got here? Let me use a name. Let's say Louise, right? Louise, just give me a follow. Thank you, Louise, by the way. I'll give you a follow back for that. I've not just seen you. Okay, so we got Louise, and you sit down, the doctor does a consultation, does some blood tests, takes your blood pressure, says, Louise, you've got low blood pressure. Here's a medication. Okay, and somehow, I don't know how this has happened. Well, I do know how it's happened in the world, because it's like, you know, we go in and we never seem to ask the question, why? Okay, doctor, thank you, I'll take the medication, but can you explain why I've got low blood pressure? Well, it's just one of those things, right? It's age related. Well, that can't be true, because look, I'm 50 years old. Most of my friends are 50. None of them are struggling with blood pressure. So why have I got it? Because if it's an age-related thing, then surely this thing would switch on for everybody at the same age, right? Oh, well, no, not necessarily. Let's look at your genetics now. So do you have any of this in your family? You any history of heart disease or blood pressure or diabetes in your family? Yes, my dad had that, right, actually. So, well, it's genetic then, isn't it? Well, that can't be true either, doctor, because my brother is 52 and he's not got blood pressure either. Well, so what's causing it? What's causing it is too much sugar in your blood. And so what they do with that is they give you a medication. And what's the class of medication? Those people struggling with low blood pressure on here, what is the class of medication they give you to treat that symptom? Do you know what class of medication they give you? Put it in the comments if you know. Have we got anybody? Let's have a look. I'll tell you what class of medication they'll give you, shall I? The class of medication they give you to treat low blood pressure is blood thinners. Robert Barber, spot on. They'll start you on an aspirin, right? Which is a blood thinner. Why? Because your blood is too thick. It's causing low blood pressure, so they'll start you on aspirin, blood thinner. But what is it doing? I mean, you take a medication, that is simply treating a symptom, right? It's not addressing the root problem. So let's have a look at this in terms of, okay, we understand now. We have a basic level understanding of how insulin resistance leads to low blood pressure, because you're chronically burdening insulin to the extent where your cells are so resistant to it, insulin can no longer deal with the amount of glucose coming into your bloodstream because your body's just overwhelmed. So then how does this thing lead, causing your blood to become thick? How does it lead to high blood pressure? Well, let's think about this for a minute, because what happens is your blood eventually becomes so thick and so sticky that as it's pumping through through your veins and arteries, it actually begins to adhere, in other words, stick to the internal walls of your arteries. Think about this. So your blood is now so thick, so sticky that as it's being pumped around your veins and your arteries, these hemoglobin blood cells, they actually begin to stick to the internal walls of your arteries. There they begin to calcify and they form into what the medical world call an arterial plaque. In other words, becomes hard. Now let's take this metaphor a little bit further, right? In terms of, okay, well then how's that leading to high blood pressure? Well, consider this for a moment. Imagine for one moment you're in the same garden and you've got a wonderful flower bed. And you bought a brand new hose. This is brand spanking new. There's not a single defect in it. You connect this up to the tap, you turn the tap on full, your hose is open at the end, fully open, and you hold that and it's pumping that water out on full blast at about 2 feet. So you can stand there and you can water every plant, every flower within a 2 feet range ahead of you. Now, if you want to, let's say beyond that flower bed, you've got another flower bed that's 3, 4, 5 feet ahead of you, and you wanted to get and to be able to water those beds without standing on the flower beds right in front of you. How would you do it? What would you do with the hose? What would you do? Well, you'd restrict it, right? You'd get the end of the hose, you'd either put your thumb over it or you'd just squeeze it. Now, what happens when you do that? That increases the pressure, right? So you then are in a position where you can stand right where you are and water those flower beds 3, 4, 5 feet ahead of you with the same hose. Now, the pressure coming into the hose remains the same. You can't increase the pressure by turning the tap more, the tap's on full. So the pressure coming into the hose remains the same. But what's happening at that point? The pressure coming out of the hose is increased. So what do you think happens here when you start to build arterial plaque on the internal walls of your arteries? And you've got an artery that's this diameter. You start to build some arterial plaque on there and it's reducing. It's reducing the diameter of your arteries. So what's happening is the pressure coming in remains the same. But at this point, the pressure coming out is what? High blood pressure. So they'll give you a medication for this as well, right? That's what they'll do. But here's the thing, this may get so bad that you may even need to have what my own father had about 12, 13 years ago. My dad, he had this arterial plaque build-up. Right, he had to go into the operating theatre. They performed a very intricate procedure and they inserted stents. Do you know what stents are? So these things get so bad, arterial plaque, it's almost a blockage. And so what they do, they'll take you in, they'll locate where this blockage is by injecting you with dye and then scanning your body, and they'll see, right, well, here is the blockage. And what they do is they come in, very intricate procedure, they'll drill through that plaque, which is opening it up a bit, it's removing the plaque, right? They're drilling through it, and then they'll go in with what's called a stent. Now, this is like a mesh scaffold. So they'll then get this stent in place. They'll get it in place inside exactly where it needs to be in your arteries. Inside the stent, there'll be a balloon, for want of a better fact. They'll then begin to inflate this balloon, and at each increment, this stent will open up, and as it opens up, it locks in place. And that this balloon, when this is the diameter it needs to be, they'll deflate the balloon, they'll remove it, and this right here is a life-saving procedure for those people struggling with arterial plaque. But let's think about here again. Don't need you driving my algorithm, my friend, so I'm just going to block you because you're boring me. Okay, so let's have a look at this. So you think about this, what's happening now? What's happening now is this is a life-saving procedure, but has it dealt with the root problem? No. You actually now have a foreign body in your arteries that's stretching your arteries. Life-saving, yes. Temporarily, yes, because you're not addressing the root problem. Your blood is still what? Still thick. Too much sugar in your blood. Now let's have a look. Have we got anybody on this live here who is in your tailgate? It's not flowing there, right? Even things like Peyronie's disease. Well, this thing leads to heart disease, it leads to strokes, etc., etc. But let's look at type 2 diabetes. We've got anybody that's type 2 or pre-diabetic? Now, if you're a type 2, put T2 in the comments. If you're pre-diabetic, put PD in the comments. Let's see how many people are struggling with this, and we'll see how insulin resistance drives this as well, shall we? Let's have a look. Bigger Drank saying my family are. Yeah, we got Sally's pre-diabetic, Hannah's pre-diabetic. We've got let's have a look. We got Honey pre-diabetic, Mackie Kim is pre-diabetic. Key Pretty is pre-diabetic. We've got pre-diabetic type 2. Okay, so we've got a few people here. Let's have a look at how this leads to pre-diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Now, remember the key indicator here is the HbA1c, right? HbA1c. So let's look at this one now, because remember the mechanism, right? You eat, the body takes the food, converts it into glucose, pushes the glucose into the bloodstream. Now, if your diet is ultra processed, right? 70% ultra processed, like the vast majority of the Western world in which we live. What's happening when you eat? 70% of carbs and sugar, that's elevating your blood sugar rapid, high, and this is erratic, right? Which is causing insulin to come in very high and deal with this chronic elevated glucose in an erratic fashion. But nevertheless, it deals with it over an extended period of time. So what it will do is it will take the glucose, deliver it as energy and nutrients to the cells. Any surplus, it will take that too, and it will begin to store in our bodies. Now, the first place it stores it is the liver. Hence, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease being the fastest growing chronic symptom of insulin resistance in the world. Anybody struggling with NAFLD? That's what it is, by the way. So it stores it in the liver, then in the muscles, and then it will begin to store it as fat. But a couple of hours or so after consuming this modern food environment diet, glucose high, insulin high, a couple of hours later, insulin's done its job, glucose is low, and you're still in the presence of insulin. Now, in the presence of insulin, you cannot burn body fat efficiently. This enhances a hormone called ghrelin. It's driving you and I hormonally to excess consumption. In actual fact, Dr. Chris Van Tull, in this book, he details that the food manufacturers are intentionally doing this. They design and engineer food that's sugary, salty, addictive. It's driving you and I hormonally to excess consumption. Okay, so let's look at this. So we're in this position now, and we're hormonally driven to a snack. Now, we snack, elevating glucose, elevating insulin. And then we're in this position, we have lunch. Now, for a period of time, your body can handle this, right? The body is very smart, it's supremely designed. And the cells become resistant. And so what will begin to happen at this point, maybe, 5, 10 years in, you start to feel low energy, low mood. The body picks up on this and the brain sends a signal to the pancreas, and what it does is it's almost like telling the pancreas to put in another shift. In other words, push out more insulin, because this knock on the door of the cells is no longer facilitating this. It's just facilitating this. So the pancreas begins to secrete more insulin. You think about this, it's putting in a second and a third shift to the extent it's producing as much insulin as it possibly can. Now, temporarily, this is a fix, right? Because insulin's no longer knocking on the door of these cells, it's banging on the door of these cells. So with a bang, the cells are doing this, right? But over a period of time, what is this doing? It's literally compounding this issue further, because even with the bang, now you're becoming more and more insulin resistant, where the pancreas are producing as much insulin as it can, banging on the door of these cells to the extent where the cells are just doing this again. So the body becomes overwhelmed with insulin. It can no longer manage this excess glucose that you and I are consuming every single day. And so what happens is you're overwhelmed with insulin, you're chronically constantly bathing in the stuff, and glucose is coming in and insulin can't manage it. It just becomes overwhelmed. So what begins to happen over a period of time now is that your HbA1c, your glucose now begins to rise. So your HbA1c will begin to rise incrementally, to the extent where in the UK, 42 to 48, you'll be classed as pre-diabetic. 48 and above, you'll be type 2 diabetic. So now you think about it. Your fuel source for every cell in your body is your blood. What feeds the blood? It's this, right? So what's happening is your elevated insulin and now your glucose, it keeps rising and rising and rising to the extent you're now pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetic. I was pre-diabetic, reversed it in 2 months. 2 months, people, by addressing this. Not this, this. But what happens at this point, you're pre-diabetic, and what do? They give you a medication. They'll start you on something like metformin, right, which works in terms of bringing the glucose down, but it doesn't help with this, right? So when that stops working, when that silver shiny thing stops working, they'll add another and another and another until eventually this chronic symptom, like many of the others, may end up taking your life. Now,